been a long trial, hasn't it? On June 7th, 2021, at the Moselle property in Colleton County, Maggie Murdaugh and Paul Murdaugh were brutally and maliciously murdered at the kennels by Alex Murdaugh. Paul, as you know, suffered 2 shotgun blasts. Maggie suffered 5 blackout rifle wounds. And after an exhaustive investigation, there is only one person who had the motive, who had the means, who had the opportunity to commit these crimes, and also whose guilty conduct after these crimes betrays him. The defendant was the one person who was living a lie. The defendant is the person on which a storm was descending, and the defendant is a person where his own storm would actually mean consequences for Maggie and Paul, and consequences for those who trusted him. And that person is the defendant, Richard Alexander Murdaugh. I know this has been a long trial because it's a complicated case. And I'm not going to talk forever, I promise. But I am going to try to distill this down for you. And the first thing I want to do is set the stage. And to set the stage, we have to understand a little bit about Alex Murdaugh and who he was and who he is. He was a person of singular prominence and respect in this community. But he's also a person who's been able to avoid accountability for all of his life. While he was outwardly giving the illusion of wealth and a very lucrative law practice, some bad land deals and that sort of thing, exacerbated by the economic recession, led to some financial problems. And then he had some big cases in the early 2011, 2012. And all his partners, and you've heard testimony to this, thought that had taken care of things. You've heard cases like the Thomas case and the Pinckney case and the Plyler case and the Badger case. But the evidence that you've heard shows that the defendant became so addicted and so dependent on a velocity of money that the millions of dollars in legal fees that he was receiving was not enough. And so he started to steal. And how did he steal? He stole by billing personal expenses to the firm. He stole by stealing from his own family. You heard the testimony about the check he stole from his brother Randy. But then the main ways were 2 schemes that he developed. And the first one was to get checks made out from the client trust account to Palmetto State Bank, to fast talk the staff and fast talk the clients with those disbursements, and then take it to Palmetto State Bank, where his buddy Russell Lafitte would convert those and use those to pay personal expenses. And each time, until the end, it worked because the client was also getting a big check. And they were walking out of there thinking that everything had been fine when it was not. But then in 2015, he opened up the fake Forge account. And then all he had to do was get disbursements paid out to the Forge account. And once he did that, he would convert those to his personal use. And to do that, though, he also had to fast talk staff and fast talk clients. And that scheme continued up until everything fell apart in the end. The other thing you have to understand is during this time when he's earning millions of dollars and stealing millions of dollars, he's also borrowing millions of dollars from wherever he can. The bank, his law partners, his father, and it still wasn't enough. And this slow burn was continuing and continuing until the boat crash happened in February of 2019. And that changed everything. That set in motion things that were going to happen because of the criminal charges related to that case as well as the civil charges related to that case. And in the aftermath of the boat case, things changed. The pace of his stealing increased. In fact, that's when he stole the money from Tony Satterfield that you heard from. ultimately stole about $4.5 million between the Satterfields and others. And unlike other cases, Tony Satterfield, who was the son of his longtime housekeeper, he took all the money, took every bit of it. And that was coming to a head as we move into the spring of 2021, because there had been some publicity, and you heard from Tony Satterfield that he was the defendant reached out in the spring of 2021 because there had been publicity and saying, hey, I'm still working on the case, everything's fine, I'm still working on the case, it's good. But the reality is the defendant didn't have that money to pay it back. And he had one saving grace, because as you've heard, they don't get paid until the end of the year. And his saving grace was the Ferris case, which they tried in December. They get the verdict and get paid in March, and that's when he convinces Chris Wilson to send those $792,000 of fees to him. But the problem is that only lasted for about 2 months. $792,000 only lasted for about 2 months. And then he's running out of money again. Meanwhile, you've heard in the boat case that Mark Tinsley was seeking to get a large personal recovery from Alex Murdaugh of $10 million because he thought, as many people did, that he was wealthy and had a lot of money. And when they said he didn't, he filed a motion to compel. And you've heard testimony about whether or not that had been granted, but it doesn't change the fact that that's what Mark Tinsley was seeking to do. And that boat case hearing had been scheduled for June 10th. In May of 2021, as we move into June, that's when Alex's own paralegal got the expense check for the Ferris case, but not the fee check, and tried to raise that to Alec and couldn't get a straight answer, tried to raise it to Chris Wilson and couldn't get a straight answer, to his office. And so it goes to Jeannie Seconder, and Jeannie Seconder goes to the partners, and they can't get an answer about that either. And they want an answer to that because they're worried, because Alec has been talking about structuring fees, and they're worried he may be trying to hide assets because of the boat case, and they don't want to be a part of that. All of these things are coming to a head, and his finances are falling apart. And you heard from the banker there. You heard where his finances were at on June 7th, 2021. And you saw what happened in the wake of that. Within a short period of time, he was negative $347,000. On June 7th, 2021, he was in the office. He was working on the boat case, working on those financial disclosures, when Jeannie Seconder came in and confronted him about those fees that he no longer had and couldn't pay back. And on June 7th, 2021, and he tells this to Jeannie Seconder, his father, Randolph, is having a very difficult time. And while they might have said it was some positive news, the reality is that he was very, very sick. And he had always been someone that the defendant could go to, that he could borrow money from. And so that pressure is happening as well. And on June 7th, 2021, as all these pressures were mounting, the defendant killed Maggie and Paul. And how do we know that? We're going to talk in detail about that. But the timeline puts him there. The forensic timeline puts him there. The use of his family weapons corroborates that. And his lies and guilty actions afterwards confirms it. And we'll go over each of those in great detail. Before we get to that, though, I want to finish out. Because in the wake of this, everything changes. All those things that were coming to a head immediately go away. It's a different world now. They're not asking about the Ferris fees anymore. And you heard testimony to that. Mark Tinsley doesn't believe the case is going to have the same value anymore because the sympathies of the case have changed after this tragedy. And you heard that. And who would better understand that than Alex Murdaugh, who does the same work? The boat case hearing goes away, and everyone immediately rallies around Alex Murdaugh. And it worked, because it allowed him to borrow $250,000 from Johnny Parker, his law partner, who of course wouldn't have loaned him that money if he knew what Alec was up to, and allowed him to go to Palmetto State Bank and get $350,000 in an off-the-books loan that hadn't even been applied for, and to send that money to Chris Wilson and convince Chris Wilson to pay another $192,000 of his own money, and to send an email to the firm that everything was okay. And that made it another month or so until Annette Griswold found that Ferris check in his office, and Jeannie Seckinger looked up the forged accounts. And what happened in the wake of that? What was the reaction of Alex Murdaugh? Within a day of September 3rd of him being forced to resign, his buddy Chris Wilson is trying to see him, comes and sees him on September 4th, and confronts him about what he's been doing. And then within 2 hours, the side of the road happens. And Alec is a victim again. When accountability was at his door, he was a victim again. And he told a extremely detailed lie and went so far as to draw a composite sketch with the police of this assailant. And the accountability that had arrived at his doorstep again, he tried to get it to go away, and it worked for a little while. People thought, oh my gosh, what's happened here? Should we be suspicious of Alec anymore? But this time it fell apart a little quicker, because his own brother figured out that he was trying to buy drugs. And the case fell apart very quickly. This is the setup for what we look at and what's going on. And it seems like a story that's far removed from most people's experience, because it is. It is a different story like has never been seen before. But the reason is that he is a different man than the kind of stories that we've seen before. This is a different set of circumstances than we've seen before. And it's certainly easy to understand when you have a middle-aged man who's outwardly successful, who has a strong family legacy, who has a prominence in the community and a reputation, but is living a lie. Is living a lie. And that leads to, and can lead to, those pressures being overwhelming and actions like this happening. Husbands have been killing wives, unfortunately, for years, and husbands killing sons goes back as far as King Herod, probably further. And those pressures mount